a great monopoly business will never talk about its monopoly. And I'm going to go through why. And this has been mentioned by some already great investors. One that comes to mind is Peter Thiel, who has done exceptionally well in the venture capital sort of space. And the reason behind why the great businesses with these massive sort of markets that they dominate don't talk about them or try and hide themselves is because they don't want the attention. So there's that saying that the tallest tree is the first to get struck down. And you start to see this particularly with a lot of companies where sometimes you'll get it where some of these businesses which are truly dominating, they might report their market share, and then all of a sudden one year they stop, and you think, well, why? What's happening? And I think you can start to see that where they might hit 40% market share, and then all of a sudden they stop. It's because they don't want to alarm regulators, competitors who may try and use regulators in their favor to basically stop this from happening. So particularly once they start to go above 40, 50, 60, 70%, that's when it sort of becomes a bit too much for others. And that's when you can sort of get anti-monopolistic regulators trying to crack down on anti-monopolistic practices. It's one of the reasons why Google compares itself to the whole advertising space, the whole marketing space, rather than just search engines, because everyone knows Google dominates search engines. But if you compare it to the whole advertising, the whole marketing space, it's only a small percentage. So that's sort of one thing they'll try and do to mask themselves, or they just don't talk about it at all. A business that I've been looking at recently has 60% market share in the marketplace category for its country. And it's funny because up until about 2022, they were reporting every single year their market share and how it was growing. And then as soon as 2022 hit where they were at 40% share, that's when they stopped sort of reporting anymore from that year onwards. And they've just sort of slowly let it fade into the abyss. And they've even stopped giving the investors metrics to calculate it. Because again, it's something where it's just not worth bragging about it. Whereas when you see businesses bragging about how dominant they are, it's usually from a place of weakness, because the true businesses just shut up and just get on with it, because they're the ones that they don't want to be shut down. They know what they have is a good thing going. Now, you could argue, if it's a small business growing rapidly, then obviously they're gonna talk about how well they're doing. But I'm just talking about in general. It's why you don't see these great monopoly businesses often talk about it. And sometimes if they do their job well enough, it can go undetected, where only industry insiders will know that it's a monopoly, and so from the looking outwards, it's not as obvious, particularly if no statistics on it are disclosed. I mean, there's, even just if you look at the US, which is, I guess you could argue is potentially more lenient in that sense. I've had multiple discussions about, well, do we break up Google? Do we break up Amazon? Do we break up Microsoft? And if so, how do we go about doing it? Because at what level, at what market cap, what point do you get to where you go, oh, actually, that's enough? And if so, how do you determine that? Because, well, are you going to do it based on market cap? Because that can be driven by a lot of hype as well. Or are you going to do it based on earnings? Well, then what businesses hide their earnings? Or what if one business is more revenue dominant versus another? So it's very difficult to sort of draw a clear line. Now, it is interesting because they have done it once before with the Rockefeller. So if you study John Rockefeller himself, he actually basically ended up having a huge monopoly on the entire oil industry, and now today a lot of these massive oil players, the giants, are basically just fractions of what was John Rockefeller's empire. So you can sort of look at that, and that's sort of the only real example I've seen in modern history where that sort of happened. And even then, the only reason I think that happened was because it was so dominant, so dominant. I mean, I think if you adjust his net worth for today, his net worth at the time would have been about $1 trillion. So relatively speaking, he was in modern history, he was the richest man alive, richer than the likes of Elon, Jeff Bezos, and so forth, just because of how dominant he was in that space. I think it is worth mentioning that if you can find a business like that, you're more than likely going to do very well. Now, I think at some point you have to weigh up the pros and cons, because sometimes I feel that if regulators have caught onto it and actually the business isn't growing anymore because it's literally taken as much market share as it realistically could, and there's no other avenues for growth, it's like, well, you've got a stable business that could potentially get split up. Then you might have to think about, well, what's going to happen if it gets split up? Like, am I going to lose money, or actually is this thing worth more in its pieces than it is as a whole? So it's just, yeah, one of those things you have to think about. But generally, that's how I look for a monopoly, or that's when I know the business's monopolies, when they stop talking about their market share. They're very silent about it, but you can just tell that they're sort of a giant in the background. Hope that's helpful.